I am the nerdy chaplain, and this is a sermon from the archives. It's called Showing Gratitude. It was originally presented at a Congregational church in Connecticut in 2016 on the fourth Sunday after Pentecost. And it is based on Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to chapter 8, verse 3. Now, last week's selection came from the beginning third of Luke's 7th chapter, and today's is from the final third. The portion skipped over is a comparison between Jesus and John the Baptist. The verses just before our selection mention how John the Baptist was an ascetic, frequently fasting, and Jesus is condemned as a glutton, a drunkard, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Now, each gospel has a version of Jesus being anointed, but they all go in different directions, reflecting the focus of the gospel writer. And Luke focuses on Jesus' concern for the social and religious outcasts. So we start with a Pharisee. We later learn his name is Simon, inviting Jesus to a meal at his house. Jesus' preaching is actually pretty close to the teachings of the Pharisees, so it is not inconceivable that he would be friendly enough with one to share a meal with one. Luke describes Jesus as doing so 3 times in his gospel. To review, the Pharisees were a political party, a social movement, and a school of thought. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the Pharisees evolved into rabbinical Judaism, which is the mainstream Judaism today. But back to the story. They were in an unnamed city, which was probably Capernaum, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The sins of the woman are not identified, probably so that we could see ourselves in her place in this situation. Upon hearing that Jesus was there having a meal, she bought an alabaster jar with ointment in it and headed over to Simon's house to anoint Jesus. Now, a private dinner in ancient Palestine could be seen more like public entertainment. So, uninvited guests appearing among them was not uncommon. Jesus and the other guests would have removed their shoes upon entering, and meals back then were eaten while reclining, with feet stretched out and away from the table. Those customs made it easy for the sinner to get into the house, up to Jesus, and start doing things to his feet. Now, the sinner is not overtly described as penitent, but one can assume remorse from her weeping and other actions. Even so, when Simon saw this happen, he is taken aback. He had assumed that Jesus was a prophet, and so he thinks that Jesus has failed to discern that the woman was a sinner. Simon doesn't say anything aloud, but Jesus knows what Simon is thinking and starts to talk to him about it. This freaked him out a little, showing that he not only discerned who the woman was, but also Simon's thoughts. Jesus tells Simon, and presumably the others around the table, the parable of the two debtors. The original context of many of Jesus' parables are lost, and it is obvious that this parable doesn't quite fit the situation. The parable tells us that a debtor's gratitude will be proportional to the debt that the creditor canceled. Nothing in the story before or after the parable suggests that the woman's emotions as she anointed Jesus' feet were those of gratitude for an earlier assurance of forgiveness. In fact, God's forgiveness was the result of the woman's love, not its occasion. Now, switching back to the story, Jesus contrasts Simon the Pharisee and his host with the woman, a sinner. Simon had not given Jesus any special courtesy, no water for his feet, nor kiss of welcome, nor anointment of the head. Jesus is treated as a casual guest or social inferior. The sinner, on the other hand, lavishes upon Jesus evidence of her love. The first half of the 47th verse is the lesson of the story, where the woman's sins are forgiven because she has great love. Love is the qualification for divine forgiveness. The second half of that verse ties in the lesson of the parable, creating a literary chiasmus. A person who is forgiven little loves little. Now, an analysis of the text reveals that Luke has interwoven two traditions. The parable of the two debtors has been inserted into a story of Jesus being anointed by a sinner. The story delivers the message that who loves much is forgiven much, while the parable's message is that who is forgiven much loves much. Even though it is not obvious that the story and the parable are two separate things, Luke wants us to take them as a single unit. Now, what we see from it as a single unit is that love is an integral component to forgiveness. Before receiving forgiveness, our penitence has a degree of love in it, causing the feelings of remorse and containing an element of hope, driving away any despair we may feel. And after receiving forgiveness, there is the awareness of God's grace and love for us, and we respond with acts of gratitude. Back then, there was sacrifice, ointments, and feet washing. Today, we sing hymns of praise, we worship, and we perform acts of love for our neighbors. All that is about divine forgiveness. But what about earthly forgiveness in our daily lives? A friend recently told me about a very well-reviewed barbecue place in Hartford called Bear's Smokehouse. They employ over 80 people, and half of them have a criminal record. The owner, a Navy veteran and competitive eater, said that we all know people, maybe within our own families, who have made mistakes. And if someone doesn't take a chance, the cycle will just keep repeating. He took a chance with one, and then more, noticing that they worked very hard, out of gratitude, and have helped make his business a success. Like the sinner who showed devotion to Jesus and received forgiveness, the former convicts employed by Bear's Smokehouse devote themselves to their work and have received a second chance. No one is perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. But we can be assured of God's grace and love that if we are truly penitent and show love and devotion, that we will be forgiven. We must remember to continue to show love and devotion towards God in our gratitude. But we must do the same for our neighbors. When we are wronged, if who wronged us is penitent, we should be as forgiving as Jesus is. Like we all said together earlier in this service in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Please join me in the spirit of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for the examples of the penitent sinner and the two debtors. May they inspire and guide us whenever we need to seek forgiveness and when we find ourselves in the position of being able to forgive others. and help us to remember to show proper gratitude when we receive your forgiveness. Amen. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.